Ace 5-3. It's a board we can see at a pretty good frequency. If you were to plug this into a solver, it would not tell you to bet full range, but a lot of people do employ a full range bet. So for the sake of simplicity and showing you guys a decent strategy, I decided to use it. I think in game you can definitely have check behinds. If you wanted to have check behinds, 10-8 would fit into that check behind range quite nicely because you don't really block anything, right? Sure, you block ace 10, ace 8, I suppose, but you also just block a lot of the middling cards that fold. I would also like a smaller size, this. I think this is a little bit too large, but this is just details. And even though villain min raise, we still have to fold, right? So even with the small sizing, he can still have a bit of success. Bit of an indication that betting full range there is quite aggressive. So if our opponent doesn't really raise us, if he doesn't really call us, if he's just very nitty and face up, you can be quite aggressive. If you're playing, let's say, at higher stakes where people are much more aggressive, where they'll check raise his board over 10% of the time and float very liberally, you have to be more passive. So basically, I'd recommend at NL50, I would probably recommend the range c-bet, but if you played, let's say, NL2K, I would not recommend the range c-bet. So it's often very close, and it depends on your opponent's tendencies as well. If your opponent defends the big blind very tight, you have to be a bit more careful. If he defends super light, obviously you can be a bit more aggressive on a board like that. Oftentimes the EV of certain hands is very, very close, and looking at your opponent should be the final decision, or looking at the rake, or looking at your preflop raise size, or looking at the stack depth, or looking at the positions. All these little details matter. So try not to, zoom through your hands, no pun intended, but really look at all the little details of the hand. All right, so we've got Queen 9 offsuit here. It's kind of the same story. I mean, it's one of those hands that can't really call a check raise. If we turn a gut shot, it's only going to be a gut shot and on a 4 straight board, so we could not end up barreling. We do block a lot of air, so most of the time you would end up check. Can we repeat that, Alan? Most of the time you would end up just checking behind. So it's important to be betting some of these lower equity hands sometimes, but obviously you cannot go insane doing so. 10-8 suited, we could 3-bet sometimes, but calling is standard. This hand is a million times better than a hand like ace-7 offsuit. You're suited, you're connected, you can check raise very aggressively on a lot of boards. And this hand actually against a small or medium-sized bet would be a good check raise. You block 10s and 8s, you have a backdoor straight draw, you have a backdoor flush draw, you have overcards. So check raising would be pretty cool here. And it's a board which is somewhat dry. You would not have to check raise extremely large. 6-deuce suited, meanwhile, is a close call. And with Queen 9, actually bluffing would be okay. We block hands like 10-9 and Queen 10 that villain may check call. We can use the club to our advantage because it's now less likely villain will play back at us. Also, obviously, on a club river, we can use it as a blocker to bluff with. So, yeah, this 10 hits ours decently well. I mean, we can have hands like Queen 10, Jack 10, 10-9 that we gave up on the flop with that now hit our range. So I would like to see a bluff here sometimes. And with 6-deuce, villain just made a good play, and we've got to fold. Third pot is a good sizing on this board. Yeah, I like this check raise. I do expect most villains to overfold to check raises. The 5 is definitely better for our defending range than it is for his opening range. So villain here will likely have ace-5 suited to open with, maybe some combinations. Let's go back a little bit. So villain here will likely open ace-5 suited every time, sometimes open hands like 6-5 and 5-4, maybe a hand like king-5, but all at discounted frequencies. Whereas we will have not only those combinations, but we'll have 5-3, 5-7, 5-8, queen-5, etc. We will have pocket 6s, but then again, so will villain. So we just have a 5x advantage. We also have more 6s, we'll have a decent amount of straight draws. Obviously, where we're way behind is overpairs. Because, I mean, we would call here with, let's say, up to 10s. Jacks would probably always 3-bet, but 10s we would call here sometimes for sure. Whereas villain obviously has aces, kings, queens, and jacks. Very easy fold with all 3 hands. Ace-5 off, easy to raise. We could raise even a bit smaller, but 2.5x is fine. King 7 suited is a loose but fine open raise. These suited kings play pretty well. And ace queen suited, I don't care that the villain doesn't have a full stack. I don't care that he made it 3x. We're definitely 3-betting ace queen suited, especially now that the small blind cold calls. I would not recommend any cold calls here, especially versus 3x, so easy squeeze for value. And usually 13 is standards. The sizing is a bit bigger, so we go a little bit larger. Around 13 to 14 big blind seems good to me. The EV difference between these sizes is minimal. Queen's obviously easy 3-bet as well. And we see a 7-5-4 board. I'm not sure how hard it hits villain. Obviously, it should hit him sometimes. I could definitely see him flatting 4 7s and 5s and then calling a squeeze. 6-3 suited, I don't really see him having, but it's not, I've seen it before, but I don't think villain has it. 8-6 suited, same thing. So, and I do expect him to have some hands like 8s, 9s, maybe 10s. Villain is not really good folding any pairs, and we have virtually the nut no pair. Ace king is the nut no pair, but villain never has ace king, I would imagine. So actually wouldn't mind seeing myself check behind here. It is a board on which we cannot see bet our full range, if that's for sure. And one thing that a lot of recreational players do is when you take an unconventional line, so let's say you check behind with a flush draw and then you hit your flush and you raise turn on river, they don't really give you credit because they think, well, he would have bet the flop on earlier street, so he can't really have it, he must be bluffing. So I actually like being a little bit deceptive here and checking behind. Yeah, I like my play. Let's cover the ace queen suited hand first. Villain leads out pretty quickly for a third pot, which is actually a pretty clever play, which makes me think that he could be a regular, although I don't like the preflop decision. Against this sizing, we definitely need a raising range. Raising here and then, reluctantly calling it off would not be the worst play. If you believe that villain is mostly like betting here with airs, hands like pocket sixes, which is a fine hand but not an amazing one, you could end up raising and then getting it in. If you believe villain is a little bit more balanced and would also be capable of betting a hand like pocket fives or pocket nines in this manner, then calling makes a bit more sense. I mean, we do have 2 other cards that are potentially live. We do obviously have a flush draw, which is live on a non-paired board. Or even when the board pairs potentially, so easy call. Now, queens is kind of annoying here. Villain calls the c-bets, and the turn, this is a really good flop for us. Villain can have 9s and maybe 4s and 3s sometimes, but other than that, he doesn't have kings or aces. We have the best hand on the flop 95% of the time. So we're very happily betting this flop, and if villain raises, we're always just shoving all in. This hand does need quite a bit of protection, and this is one of the unfortunate cards we needed protection against. So we could end up betting small here and potentially even fold to a shove. I think checking in theory is a little bit better unless we believe our villain is especially loose. On these flush cards, we have to be careful, right? Villain likely has pocket sixes very often, and he obviously has quite a few flushes. And with ace queen suited, I think we just gotta fold. Yes, we beat a couple of hands like jack 10 or random overcards, but I don't think we represent a 6 well enough to raise, and I don't think he's bluffing enough for us to want to call. Now the cutoff here bets a little bit over third pot. I think we just want to end up calling. He could overplay a worse hand, like for instance 10s plus diamond, so I do think we have the equity to call. The only issue is what's called our visibility. It's very difficult to manage or to navigate later streets. So I'd end up calling here and figuring it out on the river. Villain's bluffs could be like a low pair plus diamond, a hand like ace queen or ace king with a diamond, or maybe he just has a hand like jack 10 of spades and decides to go for it. That hand is not a good, that's not a good card because 10s plus diamond or without a diamond get there. 10-9 suited is a little bit of an overplay, but it gets there as well. So we are really hoping villain checks behind. 7-8 is a little bit too loose, but I don't mind opening. King jack suited, we call a min 3-bet, I believe. Let's go back a little bit. Yeah, King Jack suited could be 4-bet sometimes, but versus this small raise, we could be up against a weaker player. We just want to call a nice hand like this in position and go for them there. So let's not make things too fancy. Especially when you flop top 2 pair. And villain quickly checks. I would like to see myself bet around half pot. When he checks here pretty quickly, it looks like he's got some kind of medium strength hand that he's going to continue with. Our hand is a little bit too vulnerable to end up checking behind. Let's say the board is 9 deuce deuce and we've got pocket nines. Checking behind makes a lot more sense because we're not really worried about anything. But right here, there's a lot more bad cards to come, so I don't mind putting in some money. So we saw ace 9 suited, which again is a loose play but a fine one. Ace king 4 is a board on which we can do a couple of things. I recently simmed this exact board. Pi Solver does a combination of big bets and small bets, but the majority of them are small bets. So what you could end up implementing is a small bet, small range bet. You could also implement a small bet as well as a big bet, which in theory is a little bit better. However, it's also way more complicated. So you're way more prone to be making mistakes. So if an NL50 player were to join bluff the spot, at first I would tell him bet range third pot. And once he moves up in stakes and becomes better at the game, we'll complicate things a bit. So I generally recommend keeping things simple but effective, and then eventually adding new layers to your game. If you learn things you don't fully understand, you'll implement them incorrectly. I mean, let's compare it to boxing, for instance. First off, you'd start with a proper stance, keeping your chin down, keeping your hands up, starting with a proper jab and head movement. These are the basic fundamentals that you'd have to learn first, and then eventually you would learn much more advanced moves. But if you're not ready for those advanced moves, you just mess things up. So you have to start with the basics. And the basics would be third pot full range, which is an excellent strategy. I could name many players who play high stakes who implement just that strategy even on this board, so it is definitely not a compromised one. It's an excellent one. Now, we did c-bet with a hand which is obviously not very good. We block some aces and kings, but that's about it. We don't really have great backdoors, only a gut shot. And now on the turn, I don't think we really need to be bluffing. We could be bluffing here with queen jack or jack 10. We can be bluffing with diamonds. We can be bluffing with some kind of low pair, even a couple of random hands that at least have slightly better blockers. This is not a hand we need to continue with. At least with some kind of random one diamond would be better, so we can end up bluffing diamond rivers. We just have absolutely nothing. Generally in a spot where you have an average betting frequency, if you have absolutely nothing, just give up. That doesn't mean you've lost a pot. You can still win on later streets. Let's go back. Imagine we have like a7 offsuit. We'd bet the flop. We'd often check the turn, and we'd bet the river for value. Same with ace8. So we could just check and then end up representing a pretty good but not amazing hand on the river with, let's say, a 3/4 pot bet size. So just because you don't bluff on the flop or the turn doesn't mean you don't get to win the hand. If you always bet every single bluff on early streets, you'll just end up being very passive on later streets and very face up and always just check folding. So mixing it up really is key. So we see a very quick flat call here. So guys, let's go back because I'm pretty big on this. At lower stakes, you'll see a lot of timing tells. I don't really pay attention to it as much anymore, but I think it's very, very important. So watch. Cutoff open raises, 1, 2, about 2 seconds, right? So imagine villain had pocket kings and he wants a flat once in a lifetime. Would he really decide that within 2 seconds? Maybe. Maybe he snap called on purpose just to confuse us. It's possible. We've all seen it. However, it's pretty unlikely, right? So if, let's say, 2% of the time that happens and 98% of the time he just has a weaker hand, those odds are perfectly fine with me, or those ratios are perfectly fine with me. So I'll be looking to squeeze a pretty wide range. I believe the button doesn't have a very strong range here, so if we squeeze, we kick the cutoff out of the pot, and we just get the button to fold, in which case we win, and if he doesn't, he'll probably end up calling with a weaker hand. Now, none of this is very relevant when you've got pocket queens, of course, but imagine we have a slightly weaker hand like pocket nines. I think squeezing still makes a lot of sense. I don't see the button flatting many hands that are ahead. So the cutoff actually cold calls here, which is, somewhat rare. He's going to do a decent amount of 4-betting. He's also going to do a lot of folding. Calling is definitely the least frequent option. That doesn't mean it's a bad play, of course. Jack 10 versus a 23 big blind stack, easy call. We cannot really 3-bet bluff this hand anymore because we're so shallow. And we see an interesting flop. So the button ends up calling, and this board definitely hits the button quite a bit. I could imagine him having maybe not nines, but definitely sixes and fives, maybe 8-7 suited, maybe on like 6-5, maybe even a hand like 9-5 or 6-9. Definitely possible. So the cutoff probably has nines, but maybe not sixes and fives, maybe 8-7. So it's a board that basically hits both players somewhat well. I can also see the cutoff having tens, jacks, maybe pocket queens, where we are a little bit deeper, kings and aces not so much, and then some flush draws, some overcards like for instance jack 10 suited, ace queen suited, etc. All in all, it's a pretty close spot. I would probably end up checking my full range here. If you believe the opponents are a little bit looser, you could end up having a betting range, but it's definitely not a board on which we can just range bet quarter pot, then just move on to the next hand. So with Jack 10, we see this pretty large bet, and that scares me a little bit. It makes me believe that villain is going to overbet shove the turn quite frequently. However, with Jack 10, I don't believe we can fold just yet. If we had a hand like, let's say, 10-9 offsuit with no hearts, folding may just be the best play. Because what's going to happen now, see, there's 1150 behind. There's 1150 in the pot, and there's 17.88 big blinds behind. I believe villain will just shove quite frequently here. And we get shoved on both table 3 and 4. With Jack 10, we block Queen 10, which kind of sucks. We don't block any hearts. We do block hand like King 10, which could play in this manner. But more often than not, I see villain just having a strong king here, or even a weaker king, or even maybe pocket queens that he overplays. So with Jack 10, I think we just have to fold. Unless you've, let's say, seen him play very poor hands in this manner. So villain shoves here for around 3x the pot. This is obviously not a great play because he basically lets us fold our medium hands, like for instance ace king of diamonds, jack 10 of clubs, pocket 8, 6-7 suited, and he just isolates himself against the nuts. And obviously he has to worry about the button because the button could show up with a good hand too. So it makes me think that this hand is a hand which is pretty good. I don't think villain is just shoving here with, let's say, deuce 3 of diamonds, let's say. I think he probably has a decent amount of pocket queens, pocket jacks, a couple of flush draws, and then occasionally the nuts as well. So it's actually pretty close. If the button folds, I think we should be calling. Having the queen of clubs means we have a bit more equity, but we do block a hand like, for instance, ace queen of clubs that could shove. If the button were to call, easy fold. And yeah, it's pretty close, 3x pot. So as you can see up above, we need 43% equity. Against flush draws, we are ahead. Against an occasional straight draw, we're ahead, but that's unlikely. Against a set, we're obviously toast. We have about 10%, maybe a bit more because of the clubs. So I think in the end, because he can overplay maybe a 9, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, against which we're doing very well, I think it's a call. It looks quite draw heavy or like protection heavy to me. Also, I'm seeing Brazil. No offense to Brazil. I love our Brazilian students, but Brazilian players tend to be on the aggressive side for sure. So if this were, let's say, against a German player, I'd be a little bit less likely to call. No offense to German players either. And, I mean, obviously we happen to get it in fantastically well with almost 91% equity. So yeah, that hand actually makes sense. Villain is thinking, well, my hand's pretty good, but there's not many runouts I really like, so let me just ship all in, so at least I don't have to think about it anymore. But that doesn't really help you, right? Because as I said, if I had pocket 8s here and I made a thinner squeeze, I would just fold. If I had a hand like a medium flush draw, I would just fold. Whereas if I had pocket nines, I'd also check the flop and he's toast. With queens, kings, and aces, I could check and he's also toast. So, or even if I squeeze with a hand like 8-7 or 6-5. So he's isolating himself against the top of my range. And also he's putting in a lot of money against the button, right? Who easily could have showed up with better. So yeah, that's not the best play of today. King 9 suited, very easy open raise. Again, these suited kings play very well. Ace 10 offsuit, we can even raise under the gun. If the pool is very loose and call happy, we could end up folding. Seeing only bad hands here, easy folds. Even if you haven't had a good hand in a while, just play your ranges, right? Sometimes you have aces 3 times in a row, sometimes you don't for 3 hours straight. That's okay, just play your ranges. 5-4 suited is a low to medium frequency 3-bet, but obviously I don't want to fold for 45 minutes straight, so I'm a little bit overly aggressive in this spot, as you can tell. So ace king, again, we see this min 3-bet, and can this be aces? Absolutely. Again, we've all seen it, right? We've all been min 3-bet, and we 4-bet in like queens, and villain ships it and he had aces. We've all had it happen to us. However, if villain 90% of the time just has a hand like ace jack offsuit or king 10 offsuit or 10 unsuited, then we're happily just getting trapped 10% of the time, right? So I'd like to see myself 4-bet here. Also, we're 200 big blinds deep, so if I were to make it somewhere between 10 and 20, it's not as if villain is just going to shove all in. And if he does shove all in, we can in fact fold. So I like this 4-bet quite a bit. 8-6 off is a pretty loose defend, but it is versus 2.5x. 6-3 deuce is obviously not a great board for us, but then again, how does villain call a 4-bet out of position on this board and really love it? Yeah, sure, he'll have hands like pocket jacks perhaps, but does he really have 5-4 suited and 6s? Not so many. So I think we can bet this board quite aggressively still. Meanwhile, 8-6 is a great hand to be both raising or stabbing with. We have 8 high, so winning the pot outright would be fantastic. We also have an open-ended straight draw, especially with the 6. We want to bet a lot because villain is going to check call ace high quite a bit, and if the turn is a deuce, obviously we're both going to have a straight, but we can get 3 streets of value. Also, we block 6-5 suited, we block 8-5 suited, which means it's more likely villain just has a hand like queen 10, which he cannot call. So I'd like to see myself pressure him quite a bit. The 4 is not a fantastic card for his range. Again, he could have it sometimes. And this is a big tell, guys, right? So villain, min 3-bets, he calls a 4-bet out of position, he check calls a flop saying, I've got something okay. And now this card doesn't help him a lot, but it sometimes does. And he just bets huge really quickly out of position. Is it possible? Again, he has 10 unsuited. Absolutely. Absolutely he can have it. But most likely villain just has a hand like ace-5 suited or pocket 5s or whatever hand he's slow played. So I don't see the average villain just call the flop with air and just donk out, right? You don't see that very often. And actually we get the predicted run out, the deuce. I swear I did not remember. Anyway, so we both can have a straight now. Villain will call a lot of aces on the turn, so I definitely like to see myself bet here. Now, we should also check behind an ace sometimes, even a 6, but a 6 not so frequently, because we just have a big 6x advantage here. So I'd like to see myself bet. Seven, 8 is a great example of a bluffing hand over multiple streets. Queen far off, we just got to fold. If there were absolutely no rake, it would still be a fold, but it would be close. And now on this river, I would like to see a 3/4 pot bet. I think we want to pressure an ace here. I believe he's got an ace very frequently. And I also don't believe that the average player will be folding an ace against a 3/4 pot bet. Now, I actually am deciding on an overbet. Probably what I'm thinking is I put villain on an ace, and we have a big 6x advantage. We also have a full house advantage. So if, let's say, we have pocket fours, we would have bet a flop and even sometimes on the turn, but he would likely have check raised the flop with a hand like 2-pair or a set. So we basically have a full house advantage and a 6-high straight advantage, whereas villain will obviously have quite a few ace-high straights, or I guess 5 high straights. So I was probably thinking I want to have an overbet size to leverage the fact that I have those big straights and full houses. And actually don't mind that play. So yeah, I actually don't mind that play. I think it's a clever play. We'd also have to employ a smaller bet size because we could potentially value bet an ace, right? And it's not as if villain is going to call us with pocket kings here if we value bet an ace for this sizing. Against a recreational player, I think this play works out great. I don't believe this player is a recreational player, but if, let's say, a recreational player were to show an ace and you bet over pot, they would all hate it and realize you could have a 6, but in the end, they still end up calling. And villain folds, which is unfortunate. All right, that 6-8 was pretty interesting. We've been going on for a little bit too long already, so it's time to wrap it up. Next month, you'll be seeing the MMANL50 footage that I will be recording shortly, and we'll be ending up at 500 Zoom. I'll also be recording a bunch of other videos that you should stay tuned for. So thanks for watching, everybody. Really appreciate it. See you at the next video, and good luck at the tables. Bye.